Having enlisted at an older age than most, Dr. Hillsman cast a somewhat jaundiced eye at the bravado of Army leadership. The kindness and empathy he has for those within the canvas walls of the field hospital extend, however, beyond the physical ailments of the soldiers he meets. In the story entitled Battle Exhaustion, Dr. Hillsman encounters the bravado of a particular field officer and comes to learn that the stress of war can hide a greater human quality. I knew this officer well in Canada. He always talked too loudly and too long on training schemes and in the mess. I should have suspected emotional instability from an incident that happened long before he went overseas. I had been training the hospital orderlies by showing them motion picture films of actual surgical operations. Hard-pressed for means of amusing his officers, the commanding officer of the training center had asked me to show the films in the officers' mess one evening. Quite a few officers were apprehensive as to whether they would faint at the sight of surgical operations, but not my friend. He swaggered in a bit and gave the impression that no matter what the others did, he certainly had no intention of fainting. In the middle of the first film, a loud thud was heard. My friend had fainted. I did not see him after he left Canada until one unforgettable night had come. His regiment was part of the bloody battering ram that was pinning down the German army. For weeks they had been living in slit trenches under continuous mortar and shell fire. Slowly they had been edging forward against machine gun positions in the face of repeated tank counterattacks. They went into position 800 strong and came out with just 200. We had just finished the last abdominal case in the resuscitation tent, and I went into the admitting tent to see if any more were there before taking on a less serious case. Stretchers were lying in orderly rows along either side of the large tent. At one end of the tent, the medical officer was leaning over a stretcher examining a field cart. I went up to him and we talked over the situation for a few minutes. I was walking slowly back to the operating theater when I heard a hoarse whisper calling my name. I went over, and lying on a stretcher was an officer. His face was covered with a mask of gray dust. His teeth were chattering from one corner of his mouth, and a thin streak of blood made a dark line in his dusty mask. His hair was matted with muddy sweat. Under the blankets, he shivered and shook. I didn't recognize him until he told me his name. It was my friend from the training camp. I reached for his field card to see what was the matter with him. He was labeled as Battle Exhaustion. I gave him a cigarette. I had to light it for him. His hand trembled so violently. I asked him how he felt. His eyes searched mine, seeking for some sign of condemnation. He said that he felt all right, but that he'd like a cup of hot coffee. I went to the operating theater and brought back a mug of coffee. I had to hold it to his lips so he could sip it. He looked up at me and whispered in agonizing self-contempt. I couldn't take it. I tried to reason with him. It was no use. His eyes still held traces of the nightmare he had been through. He didn't ask me what I thought of him, but his eyes were alert for any sign of contempt. I left him with some cigarettes and went back to work. He was sent back to the base hospital that night. I met my friend in the streets of Antwerp 3 months later. He had insisted on trying combat duty again. He had been sent back once more as an exhaustion case and was on his way up to try it for a third time. We had quite a talk about his troubles this time. He simply couldn't control his imagination and froze to the ground under fire. He honestly hoped he would get a bad hit to wipe out his disgrace, but in spite of his determination, he went all still to pieces under pressure. This time, he was determined to stick it. A month later, I was back in Antwerp, sitting in my truck outside a general hospital. My friend walked out and without any preliminaries blurted out, "I'm through." I asked to be sent back this time. "I'm afraid I'll let my men down, and I can't take it." He walked away without another word. It took a brave man to drive that unstable temperament back into battle 3